First of all, welcome everybody, everyone on Zoom, and we'll get started. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So tonight's talk, whether we get through the whole of the thing tonight and then do the rest on the next night, who knows? Anyway, we'll make a start. Tonight's I wanted to look at the 4 groups of 5 and to try to suggest to you how they might be interrelated and how they might help each other, or how they in a way need each other, and why they need each other. So tonight we'll start with oh my God, I just saw myself on the screen. Tonight we'll start with the precepts. And you know that the tradition, and it is just that, it's a tradition, it's not set in concrete, is that the lay people will go to a monk or a nun and they will ask to be given the triple refuge and the precepts. And the monk will respond by reciting the precepts, usually in Pali, although it's not really necessary, although some people think it is, in Pali. So, and you all know them, I'm sure, you know, the Panatipata we Ramani Sikapadang Samadhyami. You know, I undertake to train myself to refrain from harming sentient beings. And then Adinadana we Ramani Sikapadang Samadhyami. I undertake to train myself to refrain from taking what is not given. And then Kamesu Michachara we Ramani Sikapadang Samadhyami. I undertake to train myself to abstain from, modern translation would be a misconduct in sensual pleasures. And it's much bigger than just sex or sexuality. The next one, Musawada we Ramani Sikapadang Samadhyami. I undertake to train myself to refrain from false speech. And then the last one, the one that when people chant it, they nearly always make a mess of it. Sura Meriyama Japa Madatana, we Ramani Sikapadang Samadhyami. And when they chant it, they often sound like they're drunk. And this one, of course, says, I undertake to train myself to refrain from taking alcohol or drugs or anything that clouds and obscures the mind. So they're the 5 precepts. In the Chinese tradition, there's a slightly different version, and it goes like this. I can't recite it in Chinese for you, but in English, the first one is, as all Buddhas refrained from killing until the end of their lives, so I too will refrain from killing until the end of my life. As all Buddhas refrained from stealing until the end of their lives, so I too will refrain from stealing until the end of my life. As all Buddhas refrained from sexual misconduct until the end of their lives, so I too will refrain from sexual misconduct until the end of my life. As all Buddhas refrained from false speech until the end of their lives, excuse me, so I too will refrain from false speech until the end of my life. And as all Buddhas refrained from alcohol until the end of their lives, so I too will refrain from alcohol until the end of my life. It's interesting to note that in the Chinese tradition, in the Chinese monasteries, you have the beginning of what we know as the tea ceremony. And the tea ceremony is actually related to the observance of that 5th precept, which interestingly we don't find in many of the suttas, the 5th precept. It appears in a few, but it seems to be missing in many others. In China, when the Dhamma went to China, it found itself up against Taoism for example, and some native Chinese traditions in which the consumption of alcohol was seen as a good thing. So the monks set about finding something else that could be used, not quite like alcohol, but nonetheless, it was something that could be used and it was seen as harmless. Anyway, that's just a sidetrack. So I suppose it's important to point out in the first place that the five precepts very often are not presented as a neat little package the way we have them now. We tend to think of them like a little block, like a what do you call that thing you do on the computer? The where you throw things up on the screen for people to look at. Oh, I can't remember what it's called now. Anyone? Oh, anyway, you know what I'm. Sorry.
Like a slide.
Yeah, and but it's got a special name. The whole process. Anyway.
PowerPoint.
Yeah, the dreaded PowerPoint. That's it. So these days we tend to think of the precepts as a bit like, oh, there's a PowerPoint, there's the five of them, and that's it. But in the very early days of the Dhamma, they weren't presented exactly like that. They do appear like that in a few suttas, but they also appear scattered in others. So part of the reason for that is that the precepts were common to many other religious traditions prior to the time of the Buddha and at the time of the Buddha, or the very, very similar kinds of precepts, apart from the one to do with intoxicants. Because in the tradition, the religious tradition at the time, there was an emphasis on the use of various intoxicants and sometimes hallucinogenics and so on, just as there was an emphasis on ritual sacrifice, the sacrificing of animals. You know, some of you might have heard of the very famous the horse sacrifice, in which hundreds and hundreds of animals were ritually slaughtered and burnt as part of a kind of Brahmanic ritual. So it's perhaps not hard to see why the very first precept for the Buddha was the precept against harming sentient beings. Pardon me, pushing my glasses back all the time. These are my computer glasses, which keep sliding off my face. People undertake them and we undertake them. And all of them, I've said this to you many times before, all of them find their foundation in the very first one, the principle of non-harming, or ahimsa, as it was called. Without that first one, the others, we could say almost that they wouldn't make as much sense, or they're not as deep anyway. A lot of people keep them with the intention to develop themselves, to help themselves grow spiritually. But it has to be admitted that also there are people who keep them out of some kind of fear of a bad rebirth, fear of, in the Thai tradition, you'll hear people say, oh, jatok narok, you'll fall into hell for sure. I love that phrase, jatok narok. And so some people keep the precepts out of fear. So they keep them out of a sort of a negative thing. And most people try to keep them positively, that is, as something which is good and which helps to cultivate virtue and make our lives and the lives of others better. Today, with the modern mindfulness movement, there's a bit of ambivalence about the precepts. Some people who teach mindfulness don't want to say anything about the precepts, and they don't want them brought in because they say, oh, this is a religious thing. But if you think about it, they're not really religious at all. In fact, in a way, you could say they correspond to the things that we regard as human rights today. So in the suttas, the five precepts are basically seen as those things which form the foundation of practice for lay people. You know, the monks, you know, have 227 because they're so naughty. So they need a lot more than lay people. And the poor nuns, they've got 300 and something, you know. Of course, they'd have to have more because they're women. So for lay people, it's just these five. But, you know, five really are enough. If you keep those five, you're doing pretty good, really. The important thing, though, to remember is that they're not commandments. You know, some people say, oh, they're the commandments of Buddhism, but they're not commandments at all. They're precepts, which means they're advice which is offered to people. You know, the second part of that word, precept, shares an origin with Sanskrit, with a word that means to offer with open hands, with two hands. So these things are offered by the Buddha as a way of developing our lives and as providing a foundation for our spiritual life and our spiritual path. The precepts also, you could say, are parts of the Noble Eightfold Path, you know, because they really belong to right speech, right action, right livelihood. That's the kind of area that they cover. Also, they are seen as, especially in traditional Buddhist countries, they're seen as ways of merit making and ways to create good karma. You know, so you know, recite the precepts, and that action itself is seen as meritorious. Now, as an example of that, I'd like to read for you a little text here, which I've put aside. Of course, here we are. This is a little text from the Anguttara Nikaya, and the Buddha says there are 8 kinds of overflowing merit, overflowing goodness. They nurture happiness and are conducive to heaven, to ripening in happiness and leading to heaven. They lead to what is likable, desirable, agreeable, to welfare and to happiness. What are the 8? And the Buddha goes on to say, this is the first kind of overflowing merit. A disciple has gone for refuge to the teaching. The first one is the disciple goes for refuge to the Buddha, then to the teaching, and then to the Sangha. So you've got those 3 that we're all familiar with, the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. The Buddha says these are, when we go to these 3 things as refuge, this is a source of great merit. He uses the image of overflowing merit. And then he says, these 5 gifts are primordial. They are long-standing, they're traditional, and they're ancient. They are uncorrupted, as they have been since the beginning. They're not being corrupted now, nor will they be. What are the 5? Yeah, so here the Buddha is actually saying, you see, I'm actually taking these from the past and I'm presenting them to you again. He says, first, a noble disciple gives up killing living creatures. By doing so, they give to countless sentient beings the gift of freedom from fear, from enmity and ill will. And they themselves enjoy unlimited freedom from fear, enmity, and goodwill. This is the first gift that is a great offering. I'm cutting it short because the whole thing is just repeated again. And then the Buddha goes on and says, furthermore, a noble disciple gives up stealing. Furthermore, a noble disciple gives up sexual misconduct. A noble disciple gives up lying, and a noble disciple gives up alcoholic drinks that cause negligence. By doing so, they give to countless sentient beings the gift of freedom from fear, enmity, and goodwill, and they also will enjoy unlimited freedom from fear, enmity, and goodwill. So the Buddha says, sensible ascetics and Brahmins. So notice here he's stepping outside just the Buddhist community. He says they don't look down on it. So the sensible ones, they don't look down on it. These are the 8 kinds of overflowing merit, overflowing goodness. They nurture happiness and are conducive to happiness, ripening in happiness and leading to heaven. They lead to what is likable, desirable, agreeable, and for welfare and happiness. So that's a little sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya, in which the Buddha points out that the idea of taking merit is actually a very early one. And for many, especially traditional Buddhists, the taking of the precepts is also a merit-making activity. Now, I suspect that for most contemporary Western Buddhists, they don't see it that way. Some might, but I suspect that many don't. Of course, traditionally, a person becomes a Buddhist, so to speak, in traditional terms, by going to a monk or a nun and asking for refuge and for the precepts. And they take them, and then they call themselves a Buddhist or a disciple of the Buddha. But again, strictly speaking, this is not necessary. You could do this by yourself. You don't have to go and find someone, but most people like to do something like that because I suppose because it embodies the thing. Instead of it just being an idea, you actually embody it, which is quite important if you think about it, to embody what you're doing. Hopefully, people will begin to embody the precepts themselves. So the precepts, when a person has taken them on board, the person has begun to cultivate them and, so to speak, let them really soak in, then their whole life will become informed by them. Or we hope anyway that that's the case, that it will be informed by them. And so after a while, people will show signs of these 5 things. And particularly the first one, the first one of, you could say, harmlessness towards others. The Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh has some really wonderful teaching on the precepts, and especially on the first precept, because he teases it out and he stretches it out in such a way that all sorts of things become part of it. And you can find that in a number of his teachings. And there are some of those on YouTube, which you can have a look at, where he's giving talks at Plum Village and in other places. So the merit-making thing is an important part of the precepts. Whether it is for you or not is a matter for yourself. Now, I'm sorry about all this. I went to the trouble of organizing all these things, and now, of course, I've done something silly to them. Where is it? Here we go. So, for the Buddha, the precepts also are meant to establish what the Buddha would think of as a kind of righteous society, not a self-righteous society, which we've got plenty of at the moment, in my view anyway, but a righteous society. That is one that is, if you like, is supported and upholds the spirit of the precepts, and one in which the people observe the precepts. So although it's seen as an ethic of restraint, that is, I will train myself to refrain from, the Buddha's at pains to point out the benefits that flow from observing the precepts, the benefits to oneself and to others. So we can keep that in mind as well, that it's not just about, I will not do something. It's I'll train myself to refrain from something or other so that these other good things can blossom, can flow out of them, or in the words of the Buddha, can overflow. And the training in this way, the training of oneself, helps us then to make progress on our path, on the path towards Nibbana. There's another little sutta I'd like to read to you, little bits of, in which the Buddha talks about what are the dangers of animosity. What are the dangerous things that we can encounter in life? And I'm going to shorten this because it's from the Anguttara Nikaya, and it's called the Vera Sutra or the Vera Sutra. And the Buddha says, which 5 forms of danger and animosity are stilled in a person practicing and following the precepts? He says, when a person takes life, then with the taking of life as a requisite condition, he produces fear and animosity in the here and now, produces fear and animosity in future lives, experiences mental concomitants of pain and despair. But when he refrains from taking life, he neither produces fear and animosity in the here and now, nor does he produce fear and animosity in the future, nor does he experience mental concomitants of pain and despair. For one who refrains from taking life, that fear and animosity is thus stilled. So the Buddha talks here about not creating, by doing these actions, not creating fear and animosity for oneself, for others, and also not creating pain and despair for oneself. And he goes through in this little sutta the same thing, stealing, engaging in harmful or unwholesome sensuous conduct, telling lies, and drinking distilled, what he calls distilled and fermented liquors. So these 5 precepts then are really central to the teaching of the Buddha, and they form the foundation. Just as we say that the Satipatthana is the foundation for meditation practice, so these are really the floor, the ground for the Buddha's teaching. I mentioned to you before the fact that there was really an extraordinary amount of ritual sacrifice that used to take place in India at the time of the Buddha and long before the time of the Buddha. And there were famous things, ceremonies like the one I mentioned to you, the horse sacrifice, which is written about very extensively in, I forgot the name of the author now. And anyway, he's an American anthropologist and historian of religion, and he describes this ritual, which is really quite horrific. You know, it involves thousands and thousands of animals of all sorts. It's called the horse sacrifice because the horse was the most expensive one that was sacrificed, and it was done every few years and required an enormous burning altar to be constructed for these animals to be burnt on. So when the Buddha appears, the very first precept the Buddha introduces is this precept of harmlessness, which did exist, of course, in the religious tradition at his time, but also it had to combat this other tradition of making sacrifices. And you might remember that this idea of ritual sacrifice was also in the Judaic tradition. You know, people went up to the temple in Jerusalem and slaughtered animals and burnt them and so on. And this is one of the things in the New Testament that that Christ speaks out against and says this is just not something worth doing. Yeah. So for most traditional Buddhists and indeed modern Buddhists, then the precepts, along with taking refuge, seem to be the kind of condition, if you like, for starting off and for calling oneself a Buddhist or a follower of the Buddhist tradition. In the Sigalovada Sutta, we read about, this is a very long sutta, so I won't read much of it, but we read about the young man who goes to the Buddha, and he tells the Buddha how his father instructed him to, in the mornings, to go to the river and to bathe himself, and then to worship with joined hands the east, the south, the west, the north, the nadir, and the zenith. And then the Buddha asked him, he says, well, why do you do this? And he says, oh, because my father, when he was dying, told me I should do this. And the Buddha says, well, look, I'll tell you another way to do something which is really very beneficial, and how to make sure that you're reborn in a happier state. And he says, there are 4 vices that you can eradicate by following these things: the destruction of life, stealing, sexual misconduct, and lying. These are the 4 vices that you can eradicate. And then he spoke again and said, killing, stealing, lying, and adultery, these 4 evils the wise will never praise. And it's later in the sutta that the Buddha then says, what are the 6 channels for dissipating wealth? And he says, indulgence in intoxicants which cause infatuation and heedlessness. So notice that the intoxicants are actually separated from the precepts. There are 4 precepts in this sutta, in the Sigalabhata Sutta. And then the one that becomes our 5th one is sitting quite separately away from those. That, I think, is just a very interesting thing to consider, why it wasn't put in until later. I told you already why in China there was such an emphasis in the Chinese tradition on not touching alcohol, and how that really formed the foundation for the origin of what's become the tea ceremony. So let's move on. So when we take the precepts, we recite them in Pali, or you can recite them in English. And then afterwards, the monk usually recites a little passage which says, Silena sugating yanti silena, Bhoga sampada silena nibuting yanti tassama silang visodayae yan. And this little thing says, these 5 precepts, they lead with good behavior to bliss, to happiness, to wealth and success, to good behavior, happiness, and therefore purify behavior. I think that the taking of the precepts is actually a very valuable act, but it has to be a conscious act. It can't be as you so often see among some groups of Buddhists, where it's just it's recited parrot fashion. And you wonder what's really going on when people are reciting it. You know, what are they thinking about? Are they thinking about something else? What's really happening? So it needs to be done very, very consciously. And the Buddha's aware of this, because the Buddha then talks about in another sutta what's required in order to break a precept. Yeah? So a precept is not broken by accident. Yeah? People might think, oh, I broke that precept, you know, I wasn't thinking, and so on. That is a kind of accidental breaking. But for the Buddha, a serious break requires that you, first of all, you understand the precept, yeah? That you know the seriousness that's involved with the thing. You know, in the case of stealing, you know the value of the thing that you're stealing. Yeah? You form the cetana, the intention to take it, and then finally, you actually take it. Yeah? So you need those conditions before, for the Buddha, you would be considered to have broken the precept. Now, this idea of breaking precepts also changes over time in different Buddhist traditions. And some traditions have a much, I'd say a much harsher, much sterner view of breaking the precepts than you find in the early Pali canon. So it's important. The Buddha says you have to, first of all, you have to know, really know and understand what the precept is. You have to make that decision that, yes, I'm going to break it, despite the fact that I know what it is. The thing has to be of some importance. Yeah. So, you know, if you if something is what could we use? Well, Thich Nhat Hanh uses the example of the 4th precept, the Musawada, where he says sometimes people will say something without thinking, and it's not true, but they don't really intend to deceive somebody. Yeah? Well, that's not really breaking the precept. Yeah? But if you set out to, you know, I'm going to tell this person this because, and you could have 1,000 reasons why you're going to tell them, but you know in your own heart and mind that it's not true, but you intend to carry it out. You know, if you've taken the precepts, that this would be a breaking of the precepts, and you go ahead and do it. This raises an interesting point, of course, and that is, what happens if you don't actually carry it out? Well, in some suttas, we find the Buddha saying that you've already done it when you form the intention and decide to do it, even if something comes up and thwarts you from doing it. So if you're going to steal something and you're all ready to do it, and then somebody comes into the room and say you can't do it, the Buddha would say you've already generated, if you like, a kind of karma around that, because you knew what it was all about, you formed the intention, you're about to do it, but you were stopped. Yeah. Perhaps we could say, it wouldn't be as serious as if you did manage to steal it, but it's still, I think it's still worth thinking about, whether it's the case, whether it requires the whole thing to be carried through. In most of the teachings, the Buddha says it has to be actually carried out at the end. The first precept, I think, can be looked at as developing kindness and compassion. I mean, this is putting it very simply, because it's not harming anyone. And the positive side of not harming is to develop this quality of kindness or loving kindness and compassion towards others, towards oneself, of course, but also towards others. Adinadana, not taking what's not given. And in the monastic tradition, this is taken to an extraordinary extreme, where if you go through a monastery and you were to drop a coin, monks are not allowed to pick that coin up because it doesn't belong to them, and so they won't take it, and it hasn't been given to them either. They might get someone to pick it up and take it to the office, but they won't touch it themselves. So the refraining from stealing or from theft, and of course theft doesn't have to be stealing objects. It can be stealing ideas, it can be stealing someone's good name when it's tied up with musawada. This, if we cultivate this, it gives rise to a kind of generosity, a willing to give to people, and renunciation, that is not picking up, just allowing things to be, not taking things to yourself that are not rightfully yours. Excuse me. Training oneself with regard to sensual pleasures, and I said to you before, this is in the early sutras, it's quite clear that this is referring to people who are married, people who are underage, concubines, and so on. But a more modern reading of this is to see it as, and this is where I like Thich Nhat Hanh's approach to the precepts, is to see it much more broadly than that. Yeah. So the training yourself to not get caught up with sensual pleasures can involve all sorts of things. It could also then cross over with some of the other precepts. Thich Nhat Hanh says, with regard to food, for example, to practice moderation when it comes to eating. So this one, the sensual pleasure one, is meant to cultivate or give rise to a certain contentment of heart and mind. And I suppose in terms of relationships, forming relationships which are faithful and full of trust, and not sort of deceiving another. The training undertaking to refrain from saying what's not true or telling lies, the thing that arises out of that, the positive thing, is developing this quality of honesty and reliability or dependability. So if you say something, you do it. My teacher used to say to me all the time, if someone asks you to do something and you say yes, then you must never, then if something else happens, then go to them and say, oh, no, well, I can't do that now. Yeah. I used to see this sometimes in the monastery where people would ask monks to go and perform a particular ceremony somewhere. and they'd agree. And then someone else would come along that had a much more fancy ceremony going on, or they were really wealthy people, and the monks would try and get somebody else to go to the first one so they could go to the second one. And my teacher was really quite hard on this. And if he saw this happening, he would put his foot down and say, no, this is not the case. And he practiced this himself. I've told some of you before that when I was living at the monastery in Phuket, there was a man who was extremely wealthy, and he purchased a piece of real estate in the center of town. He demolished what had been a night dance hall called Phuket Ratri, Night Flower. It was a kind of disco, but all the girls had numbers, and you paid and got a ticket and you danced with that girl. So he bought this building, which was huge, demolished it, and he was going to build a hotel. And he came to my teacher, and I happened to be there at the time. And he asked him, would he come and do the blessing ceremony for the turning of the soil? And my teacher said, yes, when is it? And he gave him a date. And I knew already that my teacher had agreed to go. In those days, there was a slum on the edge of town in Phuket. And he had agreed to go there and perform a ceremony for a family whose daughter had died. And he said to this man, oh, I'm very sorry, I can't, because I already have a commitment that day. And this man looked around the room and said to my teacher, oh, this monastery needs a lot of work. You know, you could do with a lot of help here, and I could help you with that. And my teacher said, well, that would be really nice if you'd like to do that, but I still can't do the ceremony. And so then he said, this man said to him, well, you know, the Chalkana Ampur, that's the next highest monk in the province, he's going, you know. And my teacher said, oh, that's great. That's really good if he's going, but I can't go. And then what was the final offer that he made? Oh, my goodness. Oh, that's right. He said, my teacher said, look, how about if you choose a different day, and then I'll be able to go. And the man said, I can't choose a different day because the fortune teller has given me the day and the time that it has to happen. And my teacher said, well, if the fortune teller says that's the best time, it won't make any difference if I'm there or not there. So he wasn't going to be, having made the commitment to this family, he wasn't going to be swayed by power or influence or money or anything else. And I went with him to that ceremony for that little family that lived in a tin shed over the most disgusting swampy water. To get to it, you had to walk on planks. And he did a much longer ceremony than he normally would do for these people. So that's part of the idea of being honest and dependable, being reliable. And then finally, the refraining from drugs and intoxicants and so on, things that cloud and obscure the mind, that is in order to foster and to help to establish real mindfulness and responsibility in our practice. So they're written or they're spoken as rules, but really they're undertakings. It's very important to understand that the wording is that I undertake. It's not that somebody tells me I should, but I undertake myself. Now, in more traditional Buddhist societies, and I suspect here too in the West, people sometimes will take the precepts and they'll observe one or two or three, and they won't observe the other two or three. So they kind of pick and choose. There was an anthropologist in Thailand who did a survey I think it was in 2010. And he found that that people who did not like the fourth precept were those most inclined to be involved in money lending and borrowing money. so that they could get away with, you know, lending money to people and then doing all sorts of terrible things and also borrowing people from money. And they would take the other precepts and think nothing of not taking that one, not observing that one. These days, I suppose we can take all of them, and some people take them but don't observe any of them. So anyway, we hope that we take them with with really good intention, with really good heart and mind, and not out of fear of bad karma or generating something like that. We don't take them out of some sort of superstitious fear, which we do see sometimes, and certainly I used to see that sometimes in Thailand, and villages would tell you all sorts of stories about somebody who broke a precept and then they fell into hell or something dreadful happened to them and so on. I think it's very important that we try and see the positive side of the precepts and develop them in that way for ourselves and for others. Now we could go a lot further with teasing out the precepts individually, but I think you can do that for yourself. There are there's a lot of discussion today. Teachers like Thich Nhat Hanh, and you might have heard of Sulak Sivarak in Thailand, and they've written about and spoken about the precepts, and they expand them out and they make them much broader than the traditional understanding, and they place them in the context of the society in which we live, which I think is actually very, very good and is how they should be seen. So it's not just pardon me, it's not just about me taking the precepts, but it's about me within that social context. And I take them with the awareness that I try to take them, I try to, pardon me, embody them for my own well-being and happiness, but also for everybody else's as well. If money is the most important goal in life, as it was in that survey that was done in Thailand, then perhaps you won't observe all of the precepts because they might trouble you too much. Well, no, I won't go there because that's it's not appropriate. Okay, so that's a little something on the precepts to begin with.
Bhante,
yes,
can I ask you about the fifth precept, intoxicant? You're talking more about alcohol, right? So, I make my own kombucha, and then it actually, I think because the fermentation process, that we actually develop the alcohol, right? So, but kombucha is more for the health benefit. So, but they do naturally have alcohol, and I just have some, after dinner, and I go red. So does it count as like, breaching the fifth precept?
Well, no, because remember, you have to have the intention.
Yeah, the intention, right?
And also a lot of medicine contains alcohol. Many years ago, I worked as a volunteer at the Matthew Talbot Hostel in Woolloomooloo. And sometimes I was put in charge of the pharmacy. Not that I knew anything about pharmacy, but one of the big things there was that the men who came in, and some of them, were highly educated individuals who'd fallen on hard times, doctors and lawyers and teachers who were now hopeless drunks, and of course, unemployed, lived on the street, and they would come into Matthew Talbot and they'd be given a bed, they'd be given the opportunity, well, they had to have a shower, they'd be given a bed, sometimes their clothes were washed if that was needed. But in the evening, when they went up to the dormitory where they slept, they would queue up to go to the pharmacy. And what they wanted at the pharmacy was cough mixture, because cough mixture has alcohol in it, And so they would say, "Oh, I've got this terrible cough, I need some cough mixture. Have you got no?" And you'd get something out, and they'd say, "No, have you got anything stronger than that?" Well, that's a lot of medicine. Certain kinds of medicine has alcohol in it. Well, you take it for that reason because of its curative powers. That's different to drinking to the point of just getting drunk or to forget things and becoming mindless and so on. I think also it's important to remember that at the time of the Buddha, there was quite a culture involving alcohol and certain hallucinogenic drugs. You would have heard of this substance, which they don't really know what it was, but it's called soma, that was taken in a ritualistic context. That was some sort of hallucinogenic. So part of the fifth precept, I think, is actually a reaction to that. Just as the first precept is a reaction to ritual killings. And there's a rule in the Vinaya, for example, for monks, and it says, I love this rule. It says, "I will not accept the gift of a black goat skin rug," and I live for the day someone will give me one. And the reason for that rule is because black goats were ritually sacrificed, right? So if someone gave you this black goat skin rug, you knew it would have come from another religious ceremony and involving ritual sacrifice. So the monks were were told they should not accept it. So I think also we have to apply common sense, and you have to use your own judgment about these things. So it's not like you're breaking out, a whole case of kombucha and drinking it in a night, are you? No,
but it's just like a small cup. It's actually enough to make you react. I mean, like, because I can't take alcohol. Yeah, I cannot. I react to alcohol.
Look, if you take certain steroids, you can get the same effect. Can't you?
Yeah, that's right.
You can. Well, you and I both know because we both take them. If you take enough of them, you can sit around smiling into the air. But the Buddha's not talking about those. He's talking about this deliberate, if you like, deliberate seeking of some kind of oblivion for the mind in the use of these substances.
Bhante?
Yes.
Oh yeah. I in fact, the fifth precept. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is more in relation to anything that's addictive. For example, like drugs. In the Buddha's time, probably they did not have the prevalence of drugs. The U.S. last year had more than 100,000 people who died from drugs. But it was also the damage to the families.
Yeah.
And then gambling. Gambling is a very big thing in a lot of societies.
Absolutely.
And that's a really, really bad addiction.
Yeah, absolutely. It would cover things like that for sure. Yeah,
so that's why I think that's why I rather think beyond just a very narrow thing.
Oh, it's too simple.
One product.
It's too simple just to say it's this and it's this, and it doesn't include other things. No, you're quite right. All of those other addictive things, those very destructive things, of course, including the misuse of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's right. Like painkillers,
Yeah, and there's a lot of that, of course. There's a big court case in America at the moment over, I forget the name of the drug, but they're suing the people who manufactured it. I think it's a bit like endone, but I don't know. So for sure, KK, you have to think about it more broadly, and you have to understand, what is the intention?
Absolutely.
And then. Because I know plenty of good Buddhists, for example, who might have a glass of wine with dinner, right? Well, I wouldn't see that as breaking the precept. Other people might, but they're not doing it so they can get drunk and fall on the floor and forget themselves and all their troubles and so on. And it's part of Western culture as well. And I think you have to take that into account. So all of this requires, I think, a sensible balance in people's lives.
Thank you, Bhante. Actually, because I've seen a lot of damage to families who have gamblers in their midst.
Oh, absolutely, KK. Yeah. It's terrible. It's really destructive. And that's why we have, like up at St. Vincent's Hospital, they have a special gambling unit. Where people who've got a gambling problem, it's free. They can go along and they can receive counselling. And you might remember. Do you remember Katie, who she got moved to the? She's a gambling counsellor. That's what
she's up in Blue Mountains.
Yeah, she's in the Blue Mountains now, but she was at part of that clinic.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Yeah.
Yeah, we last saw at the Blue Mountains retreat.
Yeah, and it's gambling is one of those things that's very hard to stop.
Yeah.
Because it's got that bait, you know, that sort of said, oh, maybe the next one I'll win. Maybe the next one I'll win. Yeah. And I think it's the same with drink, you know, or maybe the next one I'll feel better. The next one I'll feel better. And even when the person feels absolutely terrible, they'll still have more. Yeah. So, and drugs are the same, aren't they? You know, people, I think I remember telling you about the young man that I was called to the ICU at St. Vincent's, who died from a multiple drug overdose. They'd gone out for a party, and this young fella had taken about 5 different drugs, and his body, in a matter of a few hours, had swollen up like you wouldn't believe. And he was dead. He was just on a machine that kept his lungs going. And the doctors asked me to talk to the family and get them to come in because they needed to turn the thing off.
Oh, you were there. Oh.
Yeah. And you know, that was taking not a drug, but you know, one thing and then this thing and then some other thing when he was out with friends, you know. So yeah, for sure, it covers, the 5th one covers much more than just alcohol and the ordinary idea of drugs. But I think it would cover things like gambling and other addictive behaviors, you know. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, because I thought we think a bit more broadly about all those addictions out there.
Yeah.
But so there means some of the translation. Normally, when we say the 5th precept, Surah Miraya is like avoid taking intoxicant. So it should be more than that, not just taking intoxicant, like KK says, like probably avoid crowding your mind.
Well, it's anything, isn't it? It's anything which if you like clouds and you know, distorts the mind. And remember, when it's the mind, for the Buddha, he's talking about the chitta, the heart mind. Yeah, because after all, when a person drinks, and if they drink to excess, it's not just the mind that gets affected, it's the heart. The heart, I don't mean the physical heart, although that gets affected too, but you know, the whole person's personality undergoes a change. Some people become really violent and aggressive, and other people become just soporific, and other people, you know, fall into some sort of hysterical state. Well, that's not just coming from the mind; it's the heart mind. But all of the precepts, you see, I think ought to be teased out and broadened out and thought about carefully. And that's why I really like teachers like Thich Nhat Hanh and their approach to it, because he's considered it really carefully, and he manages to say, okay, let's look at the first precept, and let's not just talk about, oh, I don't kill things, yeah, but let's think about, okay, how can I lead, if you like, a more wholesome, skillful, beneficial life in which I don't cause harm, not just by killing, but in any other way as well. Yeah? So he talks about, for example, not causing harm by getting involved in the manufacture of harmful things, you know, like weapons, for example. He even talks about, you know, is it a good thing? Is it a good career choice to be a policeman? Yeah, because inevitably you're going to harm somebody, even though the intention is not to harm somebody, although sometimes they do, of course. Anyway, I'll leave you to explore that for yourself and maybe chase up some of Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching on the precepts. They're very good. So, hello, Molly.
Hello, Bhante.
I can see you peeping around the corner.
Yeah. Actually, Bhante, now I've forgotten what I was going to say. We say that the precepts as given normally says we refrain, but there's another school of thought that says that we should be more positive in our thinking and say that instead of saying that we refrain from, we say that we nurture it. For example, you know, like refrain from taking life, then we put it as we nurture life.
Yeah, and you can do that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I mean, the idea is if you're reciting it as a formula, I mean, part of the trouble, it seems to me, in the Buddhist tradition is that things have become so formulaic. So people think, oh, it has to be like this, you know. I remember when I first ordained in Thailand, you know, people said to me, and I was practicing, because you have to learn the chant. Well, I did anyway. I had to learn the chanting off for the ordination ceremony by heart, right? And at the time, I was living near the sea, near the beach. And I was walking up and down in the evening, reciting this to myself, right? And a couple of Thai fishermen heard me, and they came running over and they said, "Oh, no, 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 you mustn't do this, because if you recite this near the sea, the nagas will come out of the ocean." Yeah? And so they had this idea that this had to be recited in only one place and in a particular way and so on. Well, to me, this is not in the spirit of the teaching of the Buddha. Yeah? This is kind of a folk belief, or a sort of something that's embedded in the culture. Yeah? Like a lot of so-called customs that we find in any religion. You know, you have to do it this way, you know. And why? Well, because that's the way we've always done it. But when we investigate, we find that's not the way it's always been done. It's changed over many hundreds and hundreds of years. So we need to exercise, I think, a lot of common sense, a lot of intelligence in the way that we approach the precepts, in the way that we try to embody them. Yeah. And it seems to me that embodying them is the most important thing. So that I become a person who, to be around this person is to be around someone who never harms anyone through body, speech, or mind. Yeah, who makes that effort, I suppose I should say. Yeah, because we're not perfect by any means. You know, yeah. And someone who doesn't steal things. You know, not just holding up banks, for heaven's sake. Hardly anyone does that. But, you know, I often think of this in terms of stealing ideas, you know, or stealing the credit for something, you know, or not saying something when you should say something, you know, because you want the credit for something, you know, which is also tied up with the fourth precept, of course. So there's an enormous amount to consider and to ponder over when we really begin to take the precepts seriously, but not as a set of rules like the 10 Commandments, you know, thou shalt not, you know, because they're not written, or they're not said in those terms. Yeah. So anyway, would anyone like to ask anything else before we proceed a little bit? Or? Okay, so I suppose the main thing was to try to point out to you what the Buddha had to say about the precepts, their historical formation. You know, I'm not that you can do that in a session like this, but to sum up, I'll use another sutta, which is the Dhammika Sutta, which I've copied here for you from Nidanataya.
Bhante, so, sorry to interrupt. Can I just let you know that the paper, it's making some rustling sound. Maybe it's too close to the microphone.
It probably is, because it's next to the computer. Okay. All right. I'll refrain from rustling the paper. So the Buddha says in this sutta, now I will tell you the layman's duty. Following it, a lay disciple would be virtuous, for it is not possible for one occupied with the household life to realize the complete bhikkhu practice. Right? So here the Buddha is saying, look, I know not everyone can practice as a monk, you know, so I'm going to give you these things, pardon me, that you can try to practice. You can. I like the idea. I train myself, yeah, because training myself means sometimes I'll fall over. Yeah, training myself means sometimes. You know, if you undertake training like swimming training, which I used to do when I was a kid, you know, you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and go to the pool down to Balmain Baths and swim a couple of miles before going to school. And then every now and again, you'd sleep in. so it was lost for that day. So when we train ourselves, sometimes we're going to forget, or we're going to stumble. Yeah. But if we make it an absolute, like I will not, yeah, then that becomes part of a kind of an egotistical thing, you know, like I will not. So here the Buddha says, I'll tell you a layman's duty. Following a lay disciple would be virtuous, for it's not possible for one occupied with the household life to realize the complete bhikkhu practice. He should not kill a living being, nor cause it to be killed, nor should he incite another to kill. Do not injure any being, either strong or weak, in the world. And in a way, you can see there's a little sort of reflection of the Metta Sutta there. Yeah, do not injure any being, either strong or weak, in the world. And then he goes on, a disciple should avoid taking anything from anywhere, knowing it to belong to another. Notice the word knowing it belonged to another. Yeah. That is, you have to have that clear understanding and clear intention. He should not steal nor incite another to steal. He should completely avoid theft. A wise one should avoid unchastity, as he would avoid falling into it, as falling into a pit of glowing charcoal. So there's your Jatok Narok, falling into hell. And of course, it has to be associated with the idea of chastity in this translation. If you are unable to lead a celibate life, you should not go to another's wife. So he says, keep things in your own backyard. Don't go around sort of chasing other people's wives. And then this is an interesting one. He says, having entered a royal court or a company of people, he should not speak lies. He should not speak lies himself, nor incite others to do so. He should completely avoid falsehood. It's interesting, the context, having entered a royal court or a company of people, he should not speak lies. And then the last one, he says, a layman who has chosen to practice this Dhamma should not indulge in the intoxicants. He should not take them nor encourage others to do so, realizing that it leads to madness. Through intoxication, foolish people perform evil deeds and cause other heedless people to do likewise. He should avoid this. This is an occasion for demerit, which stupefies the mind and is the pleasure of foolish people. So here the Buddha's putting them in a slightly different way in this sutta. He goes on then to add the further 3 precepts, which we know as the 8 precepts. He says, do not kill a living being, do not take what is not given, do not speak a lie, do not drink intoxicants, abstain from sexual intercourse. Do not. This is for practicing, when you take 8 precepts, if you're going to practice all day. Do not eat food at night or at the wrong time. Do not wear flower garlands or perfumes, and use the ground as a bed or sleep on a mat. And this is something that people like to do sometimes on retreat. Or sometimes people will do it at home. They'll have a day where they keep the 8 precepts. Try to keep the 5 as a normal thing, and then maybe have 1 day a week or 1 day a fortnight where they observe the 8 precepts as a more intensive day of practice. So the Buddha finishes by saying, with a gladdened mind, observe the observance day, the upasata, complete with its 8 factors. So this is the day according to the phases of the moon, which is still in traditional countries like Thailand still observed, and in Sri Lanka too, of course. And then he ends by saying you should support your mother and father as your duty, and engage in lawful trading. A layman who carries this out diligently goes to the devas called self-radiant devas. So this is the little promise at the end, that if we can live this way, we'll finish up joining the self-radiant devas, whatever that means. So these are some aspects of the 5 precepts, which I'd like you to think about, and I'd like you to really contemplate them during the week, because the next time we meet, we'll deal with the hindrances, which really are the obstacles that we run up against frequently. So the precepts are to help us with the hindrances and other things. So next time we meet, we'll have a look at the hindrances and see what the relationship between the 2 is, and then hopefully look at the hindrances and the 5 recollections and so on. So I think we might stop there unless anyone's got any questions, and then we'll do some meditation practice together. Okay, let's do some practice.
I think Sue has a question.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Bhante, I just wanted
Sorry,
to ask about the flower garlands and the perfumes, because they seem pretty trivial compared to most of the others.
I think it's to do with the idea of beautifying oneself. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, you mean we might be giving up all kinds of makeup and
yeah, just for that
and
day,
hairdressers and whatever.
Yeah, you know, I always remember once when I was giving a retreat up at Wat Buddha Dhamma, being absolutely bowled over by the sight of a lady coming up the path. Now, to be fair to her, she wasn't doing the retreat, but she was visiting, and she had a bouffant hairdo like who's that crazy English author who writes all those romance books? Barbara Cartland. So she had a hairdo like Barbara Cartland. She had a pair of high heel stiletto shoes on. You can imagine what they were like in sand going up to, and she was dressed like she was going to some very expensive wedding. And she had tons of jewelry, more makeup on than you could poke a stick at. And I just thought to myself, fancy dressing like that to go to a place like this. It just seemed so incongruous. She looked like Imelda Marcos. So I think this idea of, not using the garlands, not using perfumes and so on is to, if you like, to let those things go for now, and to just focus on, your day of practice or your afternoon of practice, whatever it is. That's all. It's not that there's something wrong with them per se, just as there's nothing wrong with a high bed. It's just that when you're practicing in this way, you make yourself, if you like, a bit more earthy, a bit more. It's not that you're looking for discomfort, because that would be wrong, because that would be falling into that ascetic trap, which the Buddha rejects, that sort of approach where I'm going to punish myself, the old Indian tradition of the tapas, the sort of punishing myself, sticking things in myself and doing all sorts of strange things like that. So I think it's just a kind of for the sake of simplicity and I suppose meeting yourself as you are, rather than dressing yourself up in some way. In the Zen tradition, when they do 18-day retreats, they don't wash, they don't have a bath. So just imagine what the Zendo smells like after 18 days with a bunch of blokes sitting around in it and sleeping in it all day. So it's no wonder they enjoy the bath at the end. They go out and wash their faces and so on, but that's all. Yeah, that must be.
Is it some types of practice that to focus within rather than without? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But of course, each Buddhist tradition has different ways of approaching these things. In some Zen traditions, for example, the monks will do a long retreat, 18 days or a month-long retreat like that. Very, very intensive.
Where is it?
Yeah, and so they'll do this very intensive retreat, and then they have a huge party at the end of it, often involving alcohol. So they'll drink sake and all sorts of things at the end of this long retreat. Well, that's part of their tradition. It's partly a cultural thing as well. Well, you won't find that going on in the Theravadan tradition. Yeah. So anyway, okay, we might do some practice because they're running out of time. Is that okay? So we'll just do a short little practice together. So just try to let all of that stuff go now, all those just ideas and words, and let yourself settle. Just bring yourself back into the body. Make it really, really simple. Again, Thich Nhat Hanh calls it coming back to myself. Yeah, because we spend so much of our day out of ourselves, moving away from ourselves, avoiding ourselves. So by resting, we can come back to ourselves. I'm sorry, you can probably hear that frog screaming outside. So let yourself rest. let yourself just be gently aware of the body, from the top of your head down to the soles of your feet. Let yourself just notice how your body is feeling at the moment. Does it feel pleasant? Feel okay? Does it feel unpleasant? Or does it seem to be neutral? Just this simple exploration of how the body is in these few moments. Let yourself be aware of the breath. Gently rising and falling. And just let that awareness of the breath lead you more deeply within the body, the heart, the mind. It's that gentle rising and falling of the breath flowing in and flowing out of the body. Just allowing yourself to be content with this moment, with this breath, with the body as it is now, and with the next breath, and the next breath. And allowing whatever feelings are present to arise, to come into being and to pass away again. And to recognize the transient nature of your experience as we sit here together. The body and the breath. Both appearing to be regular and stable, and yet both continually changing. And trying to carry the spirit of the precepts into this little tiny practice. That engaging in this practice, you are not harming anybody. You're not harming yourself. You're not harming anybody else. In the words of the Buddha, you're actually doing something which causes merit to be overflowing. Practicing in this very, very simple way, you're not taking anything. You're not grasping after anything. You let go of the idea, I want this, I want that, I want this kind of meditation experience, I want that kind. Or conversely, I don't want this, I don't want that. No. Just resting in the body, resting in the breath. trusting in the power of the precepts to protect you, to be a refuge. Recognizing that as you rest like this, you don't need the grasping after sensuous things. You can be quite content to rest in these moments as they arise, as they pass away. That this body and this breath is enough in this moment. And by resting in this way, you are being truthful. You're being true to yourself. You're not running away from your own experience. You're not avoiding things. You're allowing things to be as they are. So you are, in a way, embodying the truth in these few moments. In these moments, this is the truth. And then finally, in these few moments, you're not intoxicating the mind. You're not clouding the mind. You're allowing the heart and the mind to be clear and open and radiant and spacious. You're letting go and dwelling in the present moment, which itself is endlessly, endlessly changing. And as we finish, I'd invite you to draw the precepts into your own body, heart, and mind in whatever way or whatever words you choose to use. You can use the formula, you can use your own words. But I invite you now to plant the seeds of the precepts within your own body, heart, and mind. And by planting them, by cultivating them, you hope to see them grow and blossom and bear great fruit for yourself and for others. Resting into the body with great attentiveness, resting into the breath. Yatha varivahapura paripurenti sakarang ewang me wangi todinang petanang upakapati chitang paritang tunghang kippa mewa samitatu sabe parentu sankapa jantopanarasoyata mani jatirasoyata Sapitio aviva chanto saparoko vina satuma te bawang tarayo sukiti kayuko bavahapiva danasili sanichang utang pachayinoja taro tamma vatanti ayuwano sukang Palang bhavatu sa pamangalang rakantu sa badevata sa babuta nubhavena sada soti bhavantu te bhavatu sa pamangalang rakantu sa badevata sa badamma nubhavena sada soti bhavantu te bhavatu sa pamangalang rakantu sa badevata sa basangkanu Pavena sada soti bhavantu te.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And can I ask all of you, while you're still there, if you would keep in your practice and in your prayer at the moment, two friends, one of whom died last weekend in France, lovely lady, and she had diabetes, and in the end she suffered from complete kidney failure and passed away. And another gentleman who I accompanied today to Prince Alfred Hospital, who has a terminal cancer diagnosis, and I had to take him up there because he can no longer drive, and stay with him while he underwent all sorts of tests, and then bring him back home again. His name is Max, and you might keep him in your prayer and practice as well. It's always good to be thinking of other people that we can share the benefit or the merit of what we do. So thank you very much for that.